Okay, so before we get started, just a couple of quick things. It was noted that people couldn't find the lecture that I wanted you guys to watch for Monday on Georgia View, so I'll go in and figure out what happened there and where that is and whether or not I forgot to post it. For tonight, you're finishing reflection paper 5, and I'm going to try to get all these graded over the weekend. I know that I haven't graded paper 4 yet, because I had to be on a plane when I would have otherwise been doing that. Yes?
This is going to sound really bad. Can you open it back up for me? I finished it really, really late and didn't turn it in on the deadline.
Yeah.
And I went to turn it back in that night and it was closed and I was like...
Yeah, sure. No, yeah. When that happens, just shoot me an email and I'll open it back up for you. Yeah.
This was like 12:30.
Yeah.
I was like, oh.
Yeah. Especially when it's that close. Yeah.
I
Just.
got my glasses, so I'm just gonna sit right here.
Yeah.
I can see it.
So for Monday, you're going to be reading a short story by Ursula K. Le Guin, who's an American fantasy writer. It's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. And what she's doing in this story is kind of putting all of the moral philosophy stuff we've been talking about into a narrative, right? So it's a short story, but it's also a kind of thought experiment. And remember to submit at least 3 words that you had to look up to the vocab folder. Now I know that at least one person in this room already has 10 points in the vocab folder, which means you no longer actually have to submit. However,
we get extra credit if we do.
yeah, if you keep submitting, I'll certainly. I want to encourage this habit, so I will certainly give you extra credit if you keep submitting. Yes.
Because I know you're talking about all of us.
Okay, so first thing I want to talk about today is the second paper, or the second big paper. Now, this is coming down the road here, right? But it's not looming immediately. However, I want you to have plenty of time to prepare for it, and I want you to have this in mind when you're writing the reflection papers, right? So this is going to be a much bigger assignment, right? It's going to be a researched argument, 2,000 to 3,000 words, and we're going to do it in 3 stages. The first stage is going to be an annotated bibliography. Then you're going to do a draft, and then you're going to do the paper. And like the first paper, you're going to take one of your reflection papers, and you're going to further develop the argument that you started in that paper, right? So does anybody have any questions about any of this so far? First off, does everybody know what an annotated bibliography is?
Nope.
Okay, so none of you have done one of these before.
No.
Okay, so there are directions here on the sheet, and I'll give you more specific directions later. But essentially, what an annotated bibliography is it's just like your works cited page, but you also give me a short paragraph that describes the contents of each of your sources, right? So the reason I want you all to do an annotated bibliography, and the reason I want you to do that first, right, is I want you to do the research before you start writing the paper, and I want you to demonstrate to me that you've read and understood the sources before you really get down to the paper, right?
So the annotated bibliography is going to be separate from paper?
It's all folded into the same assignment, but yeah, you'll turn that in earlier.
So we can use multiple sources for this paper, right?
Yes, in fact, I will expect you to use 5 secondary sources.
At least 5?
Galileo?
Pardon?
Should we use Galileo? Academic journals?
Yes. Yes to both of those. So you should be using at least 5 and no more than 7, right? If you don't use, if you use fewer than 5, then you're not consulting a broad enough spectrum, right? If you use more than 7, then you're probably overwhelming your own voice in the paper and using too much source material. So yeah, 5 to 7 is your sweet spot. In fact, probably stick closer to 5 for this. Now, in terms of what constitutes a valid secondary source for this class, to address Elena's question. So, I want you to use only scholarly peer-reviewed sources. This will be fairly easy to do if you stick to stuff that you get from our library, right? Or using our library databases like Galileo, right? There are actually more specific databases that might help you more than Galileo will, because Galileo, like when you go into Galileo and you type in that search bar, right? It just searches everything, right? So you're going to get a lot of stuff that's irrelevant. I will show you some databases that are more specific to particular fields that will generate more relevant results more consistently. But they're all within Galileo. But we'll do that later on when we get closer to the assignment being due.
So do we have to use the library?
Essentially, yeah. That is, I want you using the library resources.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. One is that anybody can post anything online, right? There's no quality control. The important thing in academic research is this peer review process, right? So does everybody know how academic peer review works? Okay, so I published an article on The Hobbit this year, right? Which is something that I actually wrote it 2 years ago, but the process kind of takes this long, right? So when I wanted to get it into print, I sent it to a journal. The editor read it to make sure that it was a fit for the journal, right? And then sent it out to a couple of experts in that field to make sure that the argument was original enough, that it was relevant, and that it wasn't completely outside the mainstream, right? That, this wasn't just, some wacko trying to publish whatever. So yeah, peer review is basically how academic journals do quality control, right? You send the paper you intend to publish out to experts, and they then will render a verdict on it, right? They'll send a letter back to the editor of the journal that says, yes, publish this, no, don't publish this, or usually what happens is publish this, but they have to make some changes. So you want sources that have been through this process, right? Now, this is also one of the problems with using something like Wikipedia, right? Now, Wikipedia's quality control has gotten a lot better over the couple of decades of its existence, but it's still not great, right? And stuff still gets through the cracks. Like, to give you an example of this, the dumbest person I went to grad school with considered himself an expert on British Romantic poetry, and so he would go in and edit all of the Wikipedia pages for the major British Romantics, like Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and John Keats and all that, and he would do so in such a way, like to prove that none of them were ever gay at all, ever. So, like, one, this is pointless, right? This is some weirdo with a bizarre axe to grind. Two, it's not true. And three, it shows that the quality control procedures there are not great, right? Because weirdos with strange axes to grind can go in and monkey with the articles. There is one, and the other problem with something like Wikipedia is that at this stage in your academic career, you probably shouldn't be using encyclopedias anyway. Right, an encyclopedia is going to give you a good general overview of a topic, right? Like if you need to know what the major exports of Bangladesh are, for example, right? But it's generally not going to give you any kind of in-depth analysis of your topic. Now, there is one thing that you can use Wikipedia or other encyclopedias for. If the article is properly done, right, if it doesn't have that flag at the top that says it does not cite sources, for example, right, what can you actually find from at the bottom, not just of a Wikipedia article, but of any encyclopedia article?
Other sources?
Yeah, there's usually a bibliography at the bottom, right? So you can use these to find other sources, right, provided that it's not an article that has been flagged, right? You can use it to find better sources. And in fact, that's actually a good idea for doing research generally, right? One of the easiest ways to do research, one of the ways to save yourselves a lot of headache, is to work backwards from the sources you already have. Right? Remember that every source that you find is gonna cite sources, right? So look at their footnotes, look at their endnotes, look at their bibliography, right? See what sources they used, and go back and consult those. What's that?
Couldn't that give you like your 5 other sources
Yeah.
that you just found
Yeah.
out and then went to this
Mhm.
website?
And you know, and one other thing that I'll do for you, right, is like typically on any particular topic, there are maybe 3 or 4 sources that are considered kind of like foundational to the study of that topic, right? So it's probably a good idea to maybe find at least 2 sources on your own and see if there are other sources that they both reference, right? If there are sources that they're both referencing, then that's probably something important that you should find.
I'm still like a little bit confused. Like I've
Okay.
never done anything like that, so.
Sure.
But, so for whenever you're saying find the sources and stuff like for the reflection paper,
Uh-huh.
like, and then you say,
Oh, you're not finding them for the reflection paper. The reflection paper, you're just writing them as you've always written them.
no, I'm saying like when we do the big writing and we choose one of the reflection papers.
Oh, okay,
And
okay.
then we find sources like for that, like what we've already, like, I'm not explaining.
Yeah, so say, for example, that you were writing about, that you want to write about the ones who walk away from homeless, right? Which we haven't read yet, but, I don't know, maybe you'll really dig it. So, what you find interesting in that maybe is the way it references or deals with Jeremy Bentham's arguments about utilitarianism, right? So what you would do is you would go into the Galileo database and you would do a search, right? You would put in the title of the text, right, in double quotes, capital letter A-N-D, and then in double quotes, utilitarianism. And then what the database will do is look for any articles contained therein that include both this title and this word, right? So in general, the best way to do your initial source, and we'll do some practice with this before you actually have to do the annotated bibliography, right? The best way to search for sources is to start specific, and then if you can't find anything, then try to use broader terms, right? Mhm.
I assume the answer is no, but are we allowed to use the first paper as our subject? Like the first?
No, it's got to be something else.
Okay.
Yep, got to be something different.
I assume.
Yeah. you assumed
Sure.
you assumed correctly.
So are you gonna like show us how to like put like the works cited within the paragraph? Like you said, it's kind of like the works cited page and then like a short paragraph with it.
Yeah, you'll do the works cited page style citation,
Would
right?
you cite it the same way we do like at the bottom? See,
Yep, same way you do at the end of your paper, and then you'll just put the paragraph describing it underneath it. But yeah, I'll give you a sample to work from. Yes.
Is this our final paper?
This is the final paper, yep. Yeah, I mean, we've only got about, like 5 weeks left in
Yeah,
the semester,
not that
yeah.
long left.
Yeah, so yeah, most of the remainder of the class is going to be devoted to getting this done.
It's been real. It's been real fun.
Oh my God.
Oh, that's so sad.
Well, this is the nature of time, right? It's the all right. Okay. So a couple more things about your sources here, about your annotated bibliography, right? So we already talked a little bit about what types of sources you're going to use and where you're going to find them. In your annotation for each source, I want you to describe the argument the source is making, right? Like what is their basic thesis, right? The credentials of the author, right? Remember that the credentials of the author are important for establishing what's called ethos or character, right? You want to make sure that the people you are citing are actually responsible experts, right? So to give you an example of this, there's a popular history book that's written from a left-wing perspective that is often challenged in school districts. It's called The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, right? Now, if you do a Google search on the People's History of the United States, one of the main critics that always comes up is a woman by the name of Mary Grabar. And she always signs everything as Mary Grabar PhD. Now, it's true that Mary Grabar does have a PhD, but she doesn't have a PhD in history, right? So she is not actually trained in historiography, right? The actual the actual methods used by professional historians. Now, there are other critiques of Zinn's work and Zinn's books from both left-wing and right-wing perspectives that are done by professional historians, right? But you always have to be careful and check up on the credentials of the sources that you're using to make sure that they're actually qualified to argue about the topic, right? So that's why you want to make sure you check on the credentials of the authors, right? Like I actually made that mistake with this Hobbit paper. I let something slip through. It was a guy who apparently has a dodgy reputation for making things up. And it was cited in the peer review process and they said, okay, hey, you need to take this out. And, lesson learned, right?
Do you
But
use a writing name or is it under your name?
What's that?
Do you use a pen name?
No, I just use my own name.
So we could find your writing.
Yeah, I mean, if you do a search in Galileo, you'll find a couple articles that I've written. Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah.
So cool.
Oh, that is cool.
Well, I mean, you can also do it for any professor on this campus, right? It's part of our job. It's part of what we're expected to do. What's that?
You have to write?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah. You have to do a certain amount of research for tenure and promotion. Yeah. So yeah, that's usually what I'm doing when I'm not teaching this class or grading your papers. Or wasting time playing old video games.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm also going to want you in each annotation. So in each annotation, right? Give me the argument the source makes, the credentials of the author, the way you intend to use the source in your paper in roughly 5 sentences, right? So tell me what you're going to do with this source as well. Also, remember that your sources don't necessarily have all the answers, right? That it's perfectly okay for you to be critical of a source that you disagree with, right? I know that often kind of feels challenging, right? It's like, well, here's an expert with a PhD in something, right? And I think they've read something the wrong way or missed something. But yeah, there's nothing, I mean, this is how knowledge advances, right? By, people noticing a flaw or an oversight in somebody's work and pointing it out, right? So it's perfectly okay for you to disagree with a source and explain why. Also, your primary source, that is the text you intend to analyze, does not count towards the 5-source minimum and thus does not need to be included in your annotated bibliography, right? So like say if you are doing your paper on Martin Buber, right, you don't include that in the annotated bibliography because it's just a given that that's part of the paper, right? You will include it in the works cited page when you give me the final paper, but it doesn't go into the annotated bibliography because it doesn't count towards your 5 sources. Okay, so any other questions about the annotated bibliography part of this?
So it will go within the essay, like, it's gonna be in our writing, or?
But so like in the final paper, when we'll just give a works cited page, we're not including an annotated
The annotated
Okay.
bibliography will be turned in separately from,
Yeah.
like it's in the same folder in Georgia View, but it'll be turned in separately from the final paper, because it is a separate assignment.
So nothing like from the annotated bibliography is like included in the final paper other than the works cited.
Exactly,
Right? Okay.
yeah. Yes.
What if we decide to change our sources after we've turned in the bibliography? Does that make sense? If we find a better one? Or
Yeah, then that's fine as long as you run them by me. Yeah, but that's like a big part of this exercise is for me to make sure before you start writing the paper that you're finding good sources and that you're using them responsibly. And to give you enough time to correct course if you're not. Okay, any other questions about the annotated bibliography or finding sources? And again, like we'll devote a day to this in class in a couple of weeks.
Would it be like smart to go ahead and start doing this?
It's
Or like, should you say to wait?
I would say probably wait until we've done a little bit more. Like we've got a couple more weeks of course reading to do, so something might really strike you. And like I don't want you to like just kind of go through the motions with the final reflection papers either if you've already picked the thing that you want to write about. But it's not a bad idea to write your reflection papers with an eye towards the future, right? And yeah, I mean, like if you want to, then like if there are particular things that we read that interest you that you want to do a little bit of research on, it probably wouldn't hurt to maybe get some sources in your back pocket. Okay, so in terms of the draft, right? So rules are pretty much the same as they were for the first paper. It's got to be 75% of the total required length of the final paper in order to receive full credit. So for this assignment, it's got to be at least 1,500. The draft has to be at least 1,500 words.
And for the draft, is it the same way as the last time? Like it just has to meet the requirements to
Yeah,
get the grade?
exactly. As long as it meets the requirements, you'll get full credit. And then the paper itself will be graded qualitatively, right? And the same thing is like the annotated bibliography will be graded qualitatively to an extent, right? So you'll get full credit for every source that you have that is valid and is being used responsibly. Okay, so rules for the draft here, right? First, right, remember you got to take a position, right? You actually have to be making an argument. So think back to the session we did on thesis statements, how to write a good thesis statement and how to recognize a bad one. Remember that there are also going to be more than two possible positions on any given issue, right? That it's not an either or, Democrat versus Republican, whatever kind of thing here, right? It's not like binary like our political system is. So try to make sure that you address a variety of possible positions that might be contrary to or even complementary to your argument. The other thing I want you all to do here as well, and this is one of the reasons why I mentioned why it's okay to be critical of a source, right? I want you to try to analyze your secondary sources the same way you would your primary source, right? Don't just kind of take what they say as law, right? Be critical of them. Look at them a little bit skeptically. Examine the language, learn the jargon, pay attention to word choice and things like that. And then last thing about the draft. Actually, one thing I've noticed thus far, and I haven't taken points off for this because, well, one, I don't usually take a lot of points off for form and grammar stuff, but also because I didn't really explain this to you. I've noticed that a lot of you have been dropping what I call floating quotes into your papers. So a floating quote is when you just kind of drop a quote in without any kind of setup or explanation and kind of leave it to speak for itself. So whenever you quote, you should be doing a couple of things, right? Like first, you should set up the quote for your reader. And I've given you an example of how to do that here, right? So in Culture and Anarchy, Matthew Arnold defines culture as something more than a set of artistic, political, or ritual practices, quote, right? And then it gives Matthew Arnold's definition of culture, right? And then after you quote, right, make sure that you explain what you take the quote to mean, and how it advances your argument. And the rules for the final paper are pretty similar to the rules for paper one, right? The one thing that I do want to stress here in terms of the final paper is that I want you to quote from both your primary and secondary sources directly, right? In part because you are going to be, for both, quoting in order to analyze, right? Not just to support the arguments you're trying to make. So yeah, just remember that that's the norm in the humanities, right? Is to quote directly, not to paraphrase or summarize. All right, so does anybody have any questions about any of this?
This is like the first paper. I know I had an issue with this, but it's
Uh-huh.
not like necessarily like the reflection paper and the fact that you're not just taking one very particular thing and explaining just that one thing. It's
Mhm.
like kind of overall of that thing.
Yeah, like with the first paper, you're taking something in so let me back up a second. Okay. So with the reflection papers, right, you are looking at a particular thing, but you should be looking at a particular thing that you think is part of a bigger pattern in the text, right?
And so this is the bigger pattern.
Yeah, and then in the final paper, you can show me the whole pattern, right? The whole fabric that this is a part of.
Okay.
Indeed, yes. Okay, so does anybody have any other questions about this? Okay, I want to remind people too that you do get extra credit for going to the Writing Center.
We'll be going.
And yeah, so the due dates are at the end here. Right? So the annotated bibliography is due in a little over a month, right? So that's going to be Monday the 6th. The draft is due Wednesday the 8th. And then the final paper is going to be due Tuesday the 14th, after we will have a chance to, we're going to do a peer review in lieu of a final exam, right? Because exams are pointless in a composition class. Okay.
Wait, so when's the last day of class?
The last day of class, I think, is the 8th.
So that same day that the draft is due is when we're having the peer review?
No, we'll be having the peer review during the finals period. Yeah, that's what we'll do, and that's what we're expected to use the finals period for something, even if we aren't actually having a final. So yeah, our finals, in my composition classes, I use it for peer review.
A lot of people are not going to show up for that.
Well, it's mandatory.
I'm done.
So where it says the final paper, that's
Uh-huh.
where we do the peer review?
That's what we're going to be doing the peer review on, yeah. So you'll have a draft with feedback first before we do the peer review. So yeah, you'll have another chance to get a couple more sets of eyes on it.
So technically that's the last day.
Yeah, that'll be the last time we actually meet, yeah. And yeah, you will have another day to work on the paper in class as well. Okay, any other questions?
Oh, for the Writing Center?
Uh-huh.
Do we need to let you know that we went, or?
They'll tell me.
Okay.
Yeah, they'll tell me. They send me an email and they tell me that you were there and what you worked on and so on and so forth. Okay. So, for today's material, I want to start with a quick free write. I want you to take 12 minutes. And I want you to try to explain the quote I'm going to put on the board. In the context of Buber's larger argument. Okay, and the quotes I want you to try to analyze here is all real living is meeting. So remember, this is low stakes, right? This isn't going to be graded. Just do the best you can. We're just trying to write our way to understanding here.
How do you say his last name?
Buber.
Can I look real quick? I don't
Oh
really-
yeah,
I
no,
forgot
you can absolutely use the book. Yeah,
I forgot what that was.
yeah, yeah. This isn't a test. It starts on 472. 2 more minutes. Okay, time's up. So who is willing to share what they wrote first?
It's hard because I know what he's saying, but
Okay.
his reasoning behind it was hard for me to understand.
Okay.
And so I don't know if I'm even right about this, but
And one thing to remember too, like one thing that might make this a little bit difficult is that it is translated from German, right? So some concepts don't translate clearly or exactly. But yeah, go ahead.
one thing that I kind of got from it, I think,
Okay.
was that the it's in life that he talks about, they're good things, and we couldn't like have the world without it. And it leads us to like new paths, and it's like a stepping stone for us. However, like the thou and like the relationships in our life is what causes our humanity to flourish through those relationships.
Okay.
And after those relationships are done, we're no longer like getting anything out of it at the moment. However, it becomes an it, and it's like a stepping stone to new relationships and a new thou.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know.
Okay. Who is that on your cup? It kind of looks a little bit like Bono.
Morgan Wallen.
Oh, okay, yeah, because it was like, yeah, but I don't think U2 is what the kids are listening to these days.
No.
Okay, what about Carmen and Elena? What about the two of you? What did you get out of this?
I feel like mine is so off. Like even when like I was reading this, I didn't understand the living
That's
there.
like I got the
I
end of
tried
it,
so
the
hard.
conclusion. I was
Okay.
like, oh, that makes sense. But then everything else, I don't know.
I thought there were two. I had two assumptions that I could make from it.
Okay.
And it was that he was talking about meeting a higher up, like grace,
Okay.
a higher power, because grace would technically be considered a higher power, something in religion.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean he wants to die, like to meet this person? Or this could also be meeting yourself, like form a connection between you and your and your consciousness. And you finally get to know yourself, and you finally see past what's happening.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that you are actually getting more out of this than you thought you were, right? So yeah, I mean the whole thing about grace, like grace is something that comes usually from some divine or higher power, right? So one of Buber's big influences is Jewish mysticism. So he is a religious thinker as well as a philosopher, right? So yeah, there is that element there. And I think, when we talk a little bit about the rest of the background, I think that, what you're saying actually does make a lot of sense in terms of what his arguments are. Carmen, what about you? What did you get out of this?
I think that, like, I'm just gonna read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
To me, the quote above means the truth in living is through meeting with others and things. He believed that, well, I put Buber's reading correlates with this. He believed that for life to have been met with, there needed to be truth and realness in it. He continuously used the two words thou and it throughout the text. He thought that with these two being met, there would be real life. The relation of thou and I is tended to support Buber's claim that all real living is meeting. Continuing throughout the, I was going to finish, but continuing throughout the reading, Buber gives traits, and the trait being the grace one or whatever.
Okay.
That thou meets him like through. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, and I know like this all sounds confusing, right? But y'all did a lot better with it than you thought you did. I will say too that like I was when I was going over this myself, remembering that I had assigned it to you, it's like, oh wow, like why did I assign Martin Buber in a freshman composition class? This is hard. But this should be maybe at least sophomore level. But anyway, I mean, you guys are actually doing a good job of wrestling with this. So let's try to step back a second to pull out some. So you all noticed that the primary binary here is between these two kinds of relationships, right? I, thou, and I, it. So the first thing I want to try to do, because I think this actually does matter, is explain a little bit why this is translated as I, thou, and not as I, you. This has to do with a quirk of German language that no longer exists in English. Right, so German has essentially two words for you, right? Du and Sie with a capital S. Sie is what's called the formal you. Sie is the you that you use. It's the form of you that you use with casual acquaintances, with people you don't know very well, even like with work friends, right? People who aren't particularly close to you. Du is the intimate you. You only use du, if you're a German speaker, with family members and with very close friends, right? You use sie with everybody else. So thou is the closest English equivalent to du. So it's meant to indicate intimacy. So English used to make this kind of separation as well. Whereas you, like our word you was the formal you and thou was the intimate you. We don't anymore, right? That's kind of dropped out of the language. And this is also actually starting to drop out of German as well. Younger people don't make this distinction as much. But yeah, so the thou in I, thou is supposed to indicate an intimate or a close relationship. So it's not just I, you, right? It's not just I, anybody, like any other person. It's I, person with whom I'm close, right? Now, Buber, broadly speaking, is an existentialist. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and trust experience and assume that nobody knows what existentialism is, right?
I've heard it a lot.
Okay. Yeah, so like you might like hear of a friend might say they're going through an existential crisis or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, like it's the colloquial use of the word actually does kind of come from a description of the philosophical school here, but existentialism is an attempt to solve one central problem here, right? And that central problem is, how do I live a meaningful life? In a world without meaning. So there are a couple of basic assumptions behind that question, right? So what's the first assumption we can say an existentialist probably makes just reading this sentence? What assumption are they making about the world?
It has no meaning.
Yeah, exactly, right? The world has no inherent meaning, right? Right? We are simply born into a world that has no given or assigned meaning when we enter it. So all meaning is produced by human thought and activity. Right? So we're the ones who make meaning out of the world that we live in, right? So following on this notion that the world has no inherent meaning, right? If the world has no inherent meaning, then we are completely free to do as we will. Because there is no other force that is going to hold us responsible for our actions, right? However, what's the reverse side of this?
That we have law and stuff.
What's that?
That we have law and stuff.
We create laws, right? Laws, remember, laws aren't given, right? Laws are made by people. If we are completely free to do as we will, right, and no other force is going to hold us responsible, then who is ultimately responsible for everything you do?
Ourselves.
Yeah, that's the dark side of this, right, is that it means you are completely responsible for everything you do. No one else, right? Not God, not fate, not nothing, right? It all falls on you. Which means that if you do something wrong, it's up to you to bear the weight of that and the consequences of it, right? Now, order and duty to an existentialist are ideas we construct to create the illusion of system. Right? We want to believe that there is some order inherent in the world. And so we make laws and we, argue that we have duties to particular institutions or whatnot in order to fool ourselves into thinking that this is something natural or this is something that matters, right? When in actuality, there's no one making meaning in the world but we ourselves. So, to an existentialist, the discovery that order and duty are basically bullshit, right? That it's all an illusion, tends to create a feeling called Angst, which in German means something like fear or anxiety, right? Like not like angst isn't like terror. Angst is more like the kind of fear that you feel like before a big test or something like that, right? And
Anxiety.
yeah. So it's like angst is like the feeling you get like when, say, you're standing on the edge of a cliff and you're kind of looking down, and you have that realization that if you fall, there's nobody to catch you, right? That is the existentialist example, right? The classic existentialist example of angst, right? That realization that there's no safety net, right? So the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who is not an existentialist but who's a big influence on existentialists, had a thought experiment that he called the eternal recurrence. And so we're going to try this and see how much angst it provokes in you. Right?
I'm scared.
So don't get scared yet. Right? So what I want you all to try to do is imagine that you are falling down a bottomless pit.
I was already imagining.
All right, then you're one step ahead. Okay, so just imagine you're falling down a bottomless pit. You know the pit is bottomless. You are never going to not be falling. On top of that, there's a little demon sitting on your shoulder who keeps whispering in your ear, "It never gets better. It never gets better. Psst, it never gets any better." How do you respond? How does that make you feel?
Can you shut up?
Yeah. I think I would be like sad because like I even think of the same thing like dying like quickly or something like that. I'm like, oh, I wanted to get married or have kids first, and now I can't do that.
Yeah.
So I think I would just be like sad.
If only I hadn't stepped into this bottomless pit. Yeah.
Have you ever seen the movie, oh my gosh, it was like the Spy Kids.
I've never actually seen Spy Kids.
Well,
No.
there's this one scene.
I was an adult when it came out.
So?
See, when you say bottomless pit like that and something on your shoulder, I think of this one scene that like they're so I can't actually process that because they're on like this mysterious island and they fall into a bottomless pit. Bottomless, keep that in mind.
Right.
And they find out it's all an illusion and there's an air vent blowing them up that keeps looking like a bottomless pit. So they're just actually floating there thinking that they're falling down this bottomless pit. But people in the room can see them just like they're in like this air vent, like in a tube, just like floating there. So I don't think it's real.
But to them, while they're still believing it, the pit is real, right? And they're reacting as though it's real.
And they eventually just give up and they're just kind of like hanging out there, like falling and like.
Yeah. Well, see, and for Nietzsche, like that would actually be the superior person's response, right? To accept that this is just what it's going to be, right? And to be strong enough in yourself and comfortable enough in yourself to accept the fact that there's no reason, there's no order, there's no safety net, right? You're never not going to be falling. The inferior person for Nietzsche is going to do things like try to cling to a wall, right? Is going to try to do something to stop themselves from falling. Is going to panic, right? Is going to behave as though they actually can put a stop to this, right? So this is the whole, thing about order and duty here, right? Order and duty being illusions, right? That kind of clinging, trying to find safety, is a metaphor for Nietzsche for order and duty, right? So Buber is heavily influenced by this particular line of thinking, right? But he's taking it in a gentler and more humane direction than someone like Nietzsche does, right? Nietzsche is basically arguing, you're on your own, kids, right? Whereas Buber is arguing that we actually make meaning not necessarily for ourselves, but through our relationships. And the way we deal with other people, right? So of these two relationship types, right, the I, thou, and the I, it, which does he seem to regard as better? Yeah, the I, thou, he regards as the superior kind of relationship, right? And what is it about the I, thou that makes it better than the I, it relationship?
That
What-
they're close relationships.
Okay, on the one hand, yeah, because the very word choice, right, suggests intimacy. And if you're treating the other person as an intimate, right, how is that different from treating them as an it? If you're treating them as an it, what are you treating them as?
An object.
Yeah, they're a thing, right? So in the I-it relationship, you are treating the other person only in accordance with whatever you need from them, right? With whatever your needs are. Like they're no different to you than like, say like, a hammer when you need to hammer a nail into a board, right? I-it relationships are determined pretty, essentially by use, right? You are fulfilling this particular need for me at this time, right? Whereas in the I-thou relationship, you are recognizing the other person as a fellow being, right? Whose thoughts, whose feelings, whose emotional and intellectual responses are just as complex and varied as your own, right? So it's only in the I-thou relationship that you see another person as a full human being, right, as a full person. Whereas in the I-it relationship, you're just looking at them for what you can get out of them. Whether it's, money, entertainment, food, sex, whatever, right? Those are all I-it relationships. Now, he also notes that the I-it relationship is bounded by time and space, while the I-thou relationship is in something that seems like a kind of eternal present. Right? Time and space don't seem to matter in the I-thou relationship, right? Why do you think that is? Why do you think the I-it relationship, like trying to put something into a specific time and space, turns a relationship into an I-it relationship?
Because if you know that like you only have like a certain amount of time with it or something, you're not gonna want to make like a real connection or something like that.
Okay, yeah, maybe that kind of recognition of time, right? Yeah.
If you're only like trying to get something out of it, it's like once you've already gotten it, you don't need it anymore.
Yeah, you can
So-
you can move on from it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I think that but yeah, both of those are good solid points. Yeah. Let's try to think of it as well in terms of some of this existentialist thinking too, right? What are time and space? They're things, yeah. But are time and space really kind of like concrete things that like we can really kind of put our finger on what they are?
If there's no clock around you, you never know what time it was.
Yeah, that's one of the weird things about the rooms in this building, right? Is that all the clocks got ripped out at some point.
They didn't start.
There's a hole up here with some wires. That's where the clock is. I have a clock here on the computer, so I know where we are and what time it is.
I never thought of that.
Mm-hmm. Does time have any real existence? Yeah. There are, in fact, some thinkers who argue that time is just a kind of artificial idea that we use to order our own experiences, right? To make them seem coherent in some way. That time has no natural existence. And we can probably say the same sort of thing for space, right? Like who decides, for example, what constitutes space?
Human.
Yeah, we do, right? We construct spaces, right? We decide what particular spaces are used for. We decide what their particular boundaries and limits are. Even if you're thinking of a space, like, for example, as large as, say, a nation, right? Does the United States have any natural existence? Does the state of Georgia have any natural existence? Why do they exist at all?
Because we made it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because human beings marked off boundaries, right? And said, okay, these are the boundaries of the United States, right? These are the boundaries of the colony, later the state of Georgia, right? So, time and space, like order and duty, are things that just have this kind of, they're ideas, right? They're human constructs that create the illusion of order. So, as far as Buber is concerned, right, these it relationships, these kind of use-based relationships, exist in the same kind of space, right? Or exist in the same kind of realm. Right, this realm of artificial constructs that we come up with in order to make our existence feel coherent and meaningful. Whereas we can actually find real meaning by treating other people as people like ourselves. Not by thinking about ways in which we can use them, or thinking about what we get out of them. All right, so does this make sense, geologists? Okay. Okay. And yeah, I figured that we were probably going to spend most of the time today just trying to parse what all of this means, right? Okay, so we're running close to time here. I think we've got the basic ideas here. So I'm going to let you all go. I forgot to put the reading questions for the Ursula again on my thumb drive because I'm still not quite back yet. So I will email those to you later today.